Hey programmers, welcome back. Right now let's work on array exercise B. So what you'll definitely want to do before we go over the walkthrough for this set of exercises is actually work through it on your own. So give it on a shot. If you get stuck, feel free to jump back to different parts in this walkthrough. So let's start with this make acronym function. So I'll bring that in. And so in this make acronym function, what I want to do is accept a sentence string as an argument. And what I want to do is return another string containing the first character of each word in the sentence. So for example, if I'm given New York, I want to return NY. If I'm given the same stuff, different day, I should return SSDD. And so notice that we're targeting just the first character of every single word over here. And it follows similarly for these other examples over here. And so let's start by just laying the foundation by writing our function definition. And like it says in this problem, we're accepting a sentence string as an argument. So the first thing I notice is when it comes to my input, I'm given one long string, but it contains multiple words in it. And it looks like in the context of the problem, I want to really target every single word, and in particular, the first character of each word. But right now, they're all grouped together in a single string. So what I want to do is really separate these words out of the sentence, right? And so what I can do is just split the sentence on a space, because how do I separate each word in my sentence? There's just a space character in between it. So what I can do is sentence.split. So it's a pretty common pattern. And if I split on the space, that's going to give me back an array of everything else. And I'll call that my words array. So just with that small line of code, let's just go ahead and see what that gives us. So I'll just return words, and we'll build this up in pieces. So I'll go ahead and open my terminal to run this code. And there we see we have every word of the sentence is in an array. So that'll be the first step to this solution. Let's go ahead and just focus in on the first example. That way we don't overwhelm ourselves. So now that I have the words separated from the sentence, what I want to do is grab the first character of every single word. And so what I want to do is iterate through this words array. So what I'll use is a classic for loop. So I'll start at let I equal 0, go up to the length of the words array, and hit every index, right? Cool. And I know that if I reference words at index I, it's going to refer to the current word that I'm iterating through. Nice. And so what I want to do there is maybe just save this variable. So I'll say let word singular equal that element, because I'm going to anticipate me like double indexing this element. In other words, word would refer to the entire word, so like new, but I really just want the first character, right? So I can say something like word at index 0 over there. So let's go ahead and just see what this gives us. I'm going to take out this return line. We'll just run this code as is. So notice I'm seeing N and Y printed out because I'm just console.logging word at index 0 here. So that's why I created this extra variable. What you could have also done is really just reference words square bracket I square bracket 0. But I'm not really a fan of writing like double index code like that too often. So you could have also wrote this, but I feel like that's a little less expressive. But we really just don't want to print out this character. What I want to do is take that first character, or really like the initials of that word, and add it to a string that I'm going to return, right? So the return type of this function should be another string. Let me go ahead and create that. So maybe at the top, I'll say let, and I'll say acronym. Make sure I spell this, acronym. Horrible at spelling, pretty good at JavaScript though. And what we'll do is set that to an empty string. Cool. And from there, what I want to do is take this initial character and just add it to acronym, just concatenate it, right? So I'll say acronym plus equals the word at index 0. So I'm just taking the first character of the word, adding it to my acronym. Cool. And only after I'm done grabbing the first character of every word, so that means after this for loop, should I just return my final acronym. So let's see what happens when we run this. It may appear to be the correct solution. Let's try all the examples though. And there's some details to be had here. So NY looks good. You may be noting in the other examples, it's not totally in line with what the examples say our function should return. Really pertaining to the capitalization, right? So it looks like our acronyms, looking at just the example output, should all be capital letters. And that's not something specifically stated in the prompt, but hopefully you noticed it in the examples, right? And so let's go ahead and implement that. And it's pretty simple to do. I just want to make sure I take the uppercase version of my characters and add them to my acronym. And where do I have those characters I'm adding? Really like over here. So what you could do is maybe like 2 uppercase if you wanted to. like this character as you add it. I don't really see a problem with that, so that works fine. What you could have also done is maybe just worry about the uppercasing till the very end. Either way is totally fine. I'm going to prefer to do it over here. So right before I return, I'm going to take all of my letters, which may be uppercase, maybe lowercase, but then turn them all definitely to uppercase. So this should be our final solution for make acronym. So let's keep it rolling and let's work on this reverse array problem. So in this problem, what I want to do is accept an array of elements as an argument and return another array, except the elements should be in reverse order. So for example, looking at the first one, I'm given an array of the elements 0, 1, 2, 3, and I return another array of 3, 2, 1, 0. So just the order reversed. Likewise, if I'm given 7, 1, 8, I should return 8, 1, 7. So what this question is asking for is pretty straightforward conceptually, but we may not really foresee how we should implement this one. But let's go ahead and just lay down the foundation for what we know we have to write, right? So the first thing I see is need to write a function. Let's go ahead and just lay down that function definition. So here I am taking in the array of some elements, and I'll think about now the return type for my function. So it should return another array. So I'll create that. I'll call it reversed. And I'm going to initialize it as an empty array. And of course, I'm going to return that by the end, right? So I'm returning my reversed array. But how can I populate the elements of this reversed array such that they are in reverse order, right? And so I know that my elements really come from my original array. I just have to be sure I add them into my reversed array in a particular order, right? And so what you could do here is utilize some just general for loop patterns, right? I know how to write a loop that can iterate backwards. So why don't I write a for loop that iterates backwards through this array? So let's write a for loop. So we're not going to write the classic like let I equals 0 for loop, because if we did that, that means the first iteration would grab the first element of the array. But looking at like the example, what I want to happen is the first iteration of my for loop should really give me the last element of the array. Then the second iteration, I want the second to last element, and so on. So hopefully you remember these patterns from really early on in the course during like our expressions exercises. But if you want to reference like the last thing of an array, what you can do is just reference its length and then decrease it by 1. So in other words, if I set I equal to the length of the array minus 1, that should refer to the very last index, right? So a quick sanity check here. Let's say I'm just looking at the first example. There are 4 elements in this array, right? 0 through 3, that's technically 4 elements. And the length of this array would be 4 because of that. If I do 4 minus 1, that gives me 3. And how do I count my indices? 0, 1, 2, 3, right? So don't forget, the length of an array is guaranteed to be 1 greater than the final index. So I'm just adjusting for that over here. That way I don't get that tedious off by 1 error. And so when it comes to my loop condition, what I want to do is loop down to the 0th index. And I do want to include it. So I'm going to loop while I is greater than or equal to index 0, right? Because I definitely want to touch the first element. Then from there, we know that our index I begins at a very large number and it should decrease after every iteration. So I'll just write I minus minus. So this is just a for loop that iterates backwards through an array. So let's just make sure we have that pattern correct by itself. So I'm just going to console.log array at index I, and we'll see what that looks like. So notice that we're not really populating our reverse array yet. So I'm going to see empty arrays return at the very end. But at least we can verify if we have the correct iterative pattern, right? So 3, 2, 1, 0. So that looks pretty good. And then from here, only one more step. What I want to do is not just print out that element, but really just push it into my reversed function. So I can say reversed.push, and I'll go ahead and push that element into the array. So I'll run that. Then we get 3, 2, 1, 0. Cool. Let's go ahead and also run this second call. Nice, and here's a proper solution for a reverse array. So just to make sure we understand the pattern for this one, let's go ahead and trace through the runtime of the second example. So I'm going to track my key variables. We know that reversed is an array that starts empty, so here it is. And let's talk about these iterations, right? So technically the first iteration of the for loop is going to grab the last element, right? So if I do a quick sanity check, 3 elements here, so the length is 3, 3 minus 1 is 2. So I look at the element at index 2, which I know is going to be 0, 1, 2. It's going to be the 8. And what I do is take that 8 and add it to the end of the reversed array. Technically, since this array is empty, the end is also the beginning, so it looks like this. But do recall that push always adds an element to the very end, or like the right-hand side of an array. So that's our first iteration, and what I do at the end of that iteration is do I minus minus. So I was referring to index 2, now it's going to refer to index 1. And I take that element and I push it to the end of the reversed array. So 1 goes over here after the 8. Cool. And final iteration, I subtract 1 again from my index. So now I is equal to 0, which means array at index I is going to refer to the 7. And I take that 7 and I push it to the end of the array over here. And we technically have one more iteration, right? So we do I minus minus. So now I would technically be -1, and I have to check my loop condition, right? I check, is -1 greater than or equal to 0? That's false. So we exit the for loop, and we just go ahead and return reversed, which is this array, right? And we managed to have all of our elements in reverse order. So this is one solution to reverse array. Just to show you a little fun trick, there are actually many array methods, and there's one that's very similar to push. So recall that push will add an element to the end of an array. There's also a kind of symmetric method to add an element to the beginning of an array. So if I were to like quickly demo that one, what I can say is, just like to have an isolated example, let's say I have an array of stuff. I'll just call it apple, banana. So this is an array of things. And if I did something like this, array.push, and let's push a kiwi in there, you know that the kiwi string is going to be at the end of the array, right? Cool. I'll make sure I go ahead and console.log the array. Otherwise, I'm not going to see anything, right? Rookie mistake. Cool. There it is. Instead of using push, there exists another method called unshift. That has a really strange name. Don't ask. And what this unshift method does is, instead of adding the element to the end of the array, it adds it to the very beginning. So it'll basically come before apple and so on. So I'll run this code and notice what happens. And so you could probably imagine how you might manage to use unshift to solve this one. If I want to like quickly change it around, here's how I would do it. So I'm just going to clear out this code and copy down this solution. I'll kind of like redo it really quick. So in the second version of the solution, what you could have done is, instead of iterating backwards, iterate forwards like you're used to. So start at I equals 0 and go up to, but not including, the array.length, and be sure to increment your indexes, right? And then from there, instead of pushing, just unshift. So now you're iterating forwards, but whenever you add an element into the array, you're going to put it at the start. So you kind of get the same behavior overall. So let's go ahead and run this one, right? And we get a very, very similar solution. So let's keep it rolling, and let's work on the your average function problem. And so in this problem, what we want to do is write a function that takes in an array of some numbers and just return the total average of all numbers in the array. And they give us a little side bit here. If the input array is empty, then the function should return null, right? Which is that special value we learned about earlier, which represents like nothingness or emptiness, and really like the deliberate absence of a value. So let's go ahead and begin to write this function. So I'm going to define your average function. It's going to take in an array of numbers. I'll call them nums this time. If I think about the strategy for calculating an average, it's always a matter of taking the total sum of all of my things and then dividing by the number of things. So I'm going to tackle that in some pieces. So let me just start with calculating the grand total of the elements in the array. So this is a very familiar pattern, right? So I'm going to say sum variable equal to 0 and just iterate through my numbers over time. And as I'm iterating through my array, what I would like to do is just take every number and add it into my sum, being sure to change that sum variable, right? So the key thing to do here is sum plus equals my current number, which is nums at index I. Cool. And for now, why don't we just go ahead and return the sum? Obviously, it's not going to be the correct answer because we need to divide still, but let's go ahead and just make sure we're summing things properly. So I'm going to run this. Cool, so it looks like we get some appropriate answers over here, but we're not quite done. What I want to do is now divide by the number of things. So this is pretty easy. Really, the number of things is going to be the length of the array, right? How many elements did I have to start with? So just finally go ahead and return sum divided by nums.length. Cool, right? So in the case of the first example, it looks like the sum of all elements is 38. To finally calculate the average, I just do 38 divided by 4, right? Because there are 4 elements here. In a similar way, I take the sum for 106, which is 106, divided by 2, and that would give me the average for those two numbers. So let's run this. And do bear in mind, we're not handling like this specific thing they asked for. So that'll probably not give us the right answer. But in any case, let's build it up. Cool, so I'm getting a few things. 9.5 is good, 53 is good, 29.6 is also good. But this last result looks a little off here, right? It looks like we're getting NaN. And recall from earlier, NaN is actually the result of any illegal math, right? It stands for not a number. So let's kind of step through why we got not a number over there. And so when we run this third example, or rather this fourth example, we know nums is going to be an empty array. So we set our sum variable equal to 0, and we attempt to iterate our for loop. But nums.length is 0, right? There are no elements. And so this for loop happens no times, because on the first iteration, I would really check, is 0, my initial index, is 0 less than 0? That's false. So I just go ahead and return my sum, which is 0, so 0 divided by 0. And that gives you not a number, right? Dividing by 0 is a kind of sketchy thing, especially when you do 0 divided by 0. And so that's why we wanted to handle this as a special case, right? You can't really calculate the average of no elements. And so to handle that, just really draw language from the prompt itself. It says if, so I'm probably going to use an if statement. So it's really straightforward. What I can do is just have like a guarding if statement at the top. I'll say, hey, if I have no numbers, so if nums.length equals 0, that means I must return the value null. And recall that null is like a literal value, so don't put it in quotes. It's not a string, right? So you actually want to say null. So let's go ahead and run this, and I'll run all of them while I'm at it. Nice, and there's our solution for your average function. So now let's work on this choose divisibles problem. And so in this one, what I should do is write a function that takes in 2 arguments. I'm going to be taking in an array of numbers and also a single target number as a second argument. And I want to return another array containing the elements of the original array that are divisible by the target, right? So let's look at the first example. So I have these elements, and I also have the target of 4. And so what I want to return are the elements of this array that are divisible by 4. And so that would really just mean the 40, the 20, and the 24, right? Numbers like 7 and 22 are not divisible by 4, so I don't include them in my output. Cool. So let's start to solve this one. I'll define my function, choose divisibles. It's going to take in some numbers and a target, which is also going to be one single number. Think about my return type. I want to return an array here, so let me go ahead and create that array. I'll call it divisibles. It's going to start empty, and I know that I'm going to return that at the very end, of course. But how should I populate that array? Well, begin by iterating through your numbers array, just so you can consider them, right? So I'm going to use that classic pattern. I just want to iterate in order here, so very nothing fancy for loop. So let me just bang that out. And now that I'm considering my numbers, let's just go ahead and say I took every single number and pushed it into my divisibles array, which would be too many numbers, right? So this isn't really checking for any divisibility yet. So if I run like the first example, I'm just going to get a straight copy of my original array. So I'm getting an error here. Divisibles.push is not a function because it's push. There's no tense here, right? So let's run that. Cool, so I have all of my numbers, but I don't want to push all of them, right? I only want to push very particular ones. And what I want to do is push the numbers that are divisible, right? So instead I'll say, hey, if my current number, or the current element I'm iterating through, if it is divisible by my target, then I should push it in that case. And remember our classic divisibility pattern. To check if something's divisible, then it should have a remainder of 0 when I divide it, right? If it's like perfectly divisible. Cool, so that's a very familiar pattern. And this should be a nice solution for this one. Cool. And notice here, like we did before in previous problems, I don't need an else statement here because what you're saying is otherwise, if the number is not divisible, don't do anything. So you just don't need to write any other code, right? Just simply wrap your action in an if statement. So this code works, but what I'll prefer to do is maybe write this expression into a variable. So instead of saying numbers at index I, it'd be pretty sweet if I just say num, because I say that expression twice, and then I can just derive it from the actual expression. So I could say let num equals numbers at index I. Prefer this code a little bit more. And I'll run all of the examples. Nice, and there's a cool solution for choose divisibles. And so now let's work on this maximum problem. So in this problem, what we want to do is write a function that takes in an array of some numbers, and we want to return the biggest number in that array. We have a little caveat here. If the array is empty, then there's not really a maximum to decide upon, so we should just return null. So it's just a special case. You may notice that this problem is very similar to what we did during the previous lecture, right? I just want to return like the biggest or smallest number of an array. And so I think off the bat, why don't I just preemptively solve like that little edge scenario? So they say if the array is empty, so I can express that in code by saying if the array has a length of 0, then what I want to do is just return the literal null. Cool. So that should immediately just solve this third test case. I'll just do a quick check. Always like to test my code as I go. All right, so that's returning null. Nice. But let's solve like the meat of this problem. And so what I want to do is return the largest number of the array. And so if I make it past this if statement and I don't return null, that means I have at least one element of the array, because that means my length is at least 1, right? And so what I can do is track my like current maximum that I'm kind of considering in a variable, and I should initialize it to maybe the first element of the array by default. So I can say maybe I'll be nice and clear here. I'll say current max equals the first element of the array. So maybe at the start, I'm gonna just choose the first element as my current max, but then I need to look at the other elements and see if any of them are able to like beat my current max and become the new max, right? Cool. So let's go ahead and now iterate through our numbers array. One thing to note here, if I write like the classic for loop that iterates from the very beginning of an array, technically I'd be looking at the first element again, but I kind of already considered it by just assigning it as a default value to current max. So I think it would be a little cleaner to instead start at I equals 1. Right, so start looking at the second element because you just already took the first element as your default current max. And now I do that classic like max value logic. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and check, hey, if the current number that I'm iterating through, so if numbers at index I, if it's bigger than my current max, then it should become the current max because it is now the best max I have, right? So I'll say current max equals numbers at index I. So the way you should interpret this code is if I find a number that is bigger than my current max, then I'll replace the current max with that bigger number. So by the end, I should have the true maximum after the for loop, right? So after the for loop, once I've looked at every single element, then I can return my current max, and it must be the true max, right? So let's give that a go. So we have 7, 19 null, and there we have it. So why don't we step through this one a little closer? Let's run through the first example. So starting from the tippy top, we check, is our array empty? And it's obviously not because we have 4 elements, right? So I have a length of 4. Is 4 equal to 0? That is false, so I do not return null. And then from there, I set my current max equal to the first element of the array. And that's going to be element 5. So I'll store that over here in a little note. And now I begin my iteration. So technically the first iteration of this for loop is where I is equal to 1. So that means my numbers I, or the element I consider, is going to be the 6 over here. And what I check is that current element 6, is that bigger than my current max, right? So is 6 bigger than 5? That is true, so I should replace my current max with that 6, right? And so 5 is no longer the winner for now, and now it's 6. Cool. That's the end of my first iteration of the loop. Now I go on. Now I is going to be 2, so that means my current element I consider, numbers at index I, that's going to be 3. And I check, is 3 bigger than my current max? In other words, is 3 bigger than 6? That's false, so I don't do any replacement here. So 6 still gets to stay. And finally, on the last iteration, I know that I is going to refer to index 3, which is the element 7, and I check, is 7 bigger than 6? That's true, so now 7 gets assigned into my current max, and 6 has to go away. And that would actually be the last iteration of this for loop, so I just return the final value within current max, which is going to be 7 over here, right? So there we have our maximum function. This is a very classic programming pattern. You're probably going to run into it a lot in your career. It's a really fun one too. So let's finally work on this last problem. Let's write word count. And so what I want to do in this problem is write a function that takes in a sentence string and also an array of single words. And what I should do is return the count of the number of words in the original sentence that are also found in target words. So let's really understand what this question is asking us to do. So in the first example, I have the input sentence, open the window please, and my array of words or my target words are please, open, and sorry. And they're saying here your function should have returned 2 for this, because if I count the number of words in the sentence that also exists in the target words array, there are 2 of them, right? So open is 1 because it's in both, right? And also please is another, so that's 2 words. Let's go ahead and look at the third example here. It's an interesting one. Here the sentence is, can I have that can? And our target words are can and I. And notice that the result is 3. That's because I have can, I have I, and I also have another can, right? And those are 3 instances of words that are found in the target words array. So notice that here we kind of double counted the word can, which is actually what we want in this problem. So that should kind of dictate how we write this code. Let's lay the foundation and let's start defining our function definition. So the first thing I'll notice in this problem is when it comes to my arguments, sentence is one long string containing all words, but I need to consider like singular words within that sentence. So if you learned previously, what you can do is you can just split that sentence on a character. And here, I want to split on a space, right? Because that would give me an array of words. So I'll say let words equals every word. So if I just run, let's say, this first example. So I'll give this a go. So we'll say node word count. Right, I have an array of every single word. Notice that I'm seeing an undefined here because my function right now returns nothing. So by default, it returns undefined, which means this console.log on line 10 is going to print out undefined. But now that I have an array of words, that gives me a nice way to iterate over them. So we'll just write a classic for loop that iterates over an array. And nothing fancy here, I just want to iterate through the entirety of the array, and you could do it in order, no reason not to. And here I'll decide to just create like an intermediate variable to store the current element. So I'll say let word equals my words at index I. So that means on the first iteration, when I is 0, that means word is going to be open. When I is 1, that means word is going to be the, and so on. So now that I have the word from the sentence, what I want to do is check if that word is inside of the target words array. So what I could do here is use that nice includes method, right? It's a nice way to quickly check, hey, is an element inside of an array? So I can just check, hey, if the target words array includes this word I'm iterating through, then I should count it. But I'm going to need to establish that counter, right? So we've done a few counting problems before. So the strategy for that is, create a variable. I'll just call it count, initialize it to 0, because basically before I consider any of my words in the sentence, count is 0 by default, right? There's nothing that we've actually counted yet. But if I find a word that is included in my target words array, then I should increment my count. So I'll write count plus plus over here. And if it's not included in my target words, then don't do anything, right? So I don't need to write an else because you're not going to do anything anyway. And then after your for loop, after you look at every single word of the array, then you're okay to just return your final count. Cool. So looking at this code, this is pretty good. Let's go ahead and give it a shot. So I'm getting 2 for that first example. Let's try all of them while we're here. And I'm really interested to see if I can solve that last one. Nice, and it totally works. Notice that since we're iterating through the words of the sentence in the for loop, we do have a means to actually count the can twice. Because on the first iteration, I have can, so it's going to have a count of 1. Then I have I, it's going to be a count of 2. I have, it's going to stay at 2. That's going to stay at 2. I see the second can, and I'm going to increment it to 3 at that point, right? So this code is good to go. So that wraps up this problem. So we had some really cool problems in this one. So what I recommend you do is, if you had trouble on any of these problems, definitely try to give them a shot on your own. If you still can't solve them on your own, then feel free to reference the video, right? But I think if you want to get the most out of this course, you should go on to like the next topic when you feel like pretty self-sufficient and good about solving these problems on your own. If there's any tip I can give you as you learn to program, it's to like hold yourself accountable, right? So if you don't feel confident yet, then linger on this topic a little bit more, try the problems again for yourself, and then move on.